Welcome to our last session. My name is not Jonathan Hildebrandt, as listed in your program. My name is Patricia Harms. I am a late fill-in. I will be here to read off the bios of our four presenters and to hold them to a 20-minute time limit, and then we'll and then we'll have time for some questions. So let me introduce the four speakers. The first person will be on Zoom. It is Paola Canova, who holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Arizona in Tucson and is currently an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. She conducts research on indigenous peoples, Mennonites, and more recently the mestizo population in the Gran Chaco region of Paraguay. She's the author of Frontier Intimacies, Ayoreo, Women and the Sexual Economy of the Paraguayan Chaco. That was published in 2020. So that'll be our first presenter. Yann Polain is an assistant professor at the Institute for the Study of International Development and the Department of Geography at McGill University. There's some words missing here. Land use change in agricultural frontiers of Latin America, particularly in the Gran Chaco region, which is situated between Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia, and has experienced drastic transformations in recent decades. To answer questions about the causes, processes, and consequences of frontier land use change, Yann combines the analysis of interviews and secondary data with mapping and satellite images. This work on frontiers is what led Dr. Polain to start paying attention to the role of Mennonite colonies in agricultural expansion in Latin America, leading to the publication in 2021 of a paper entitled Pious Pioneers, the Expansion of Mennonite Colonies in Latin America. Currently, Dr. Polain continues this work by looking at the role of culture in shaping land use decisions in Mennonite colonies. Our third presenter is Carel Roessingh, who studied cultural anthropology and received his PhD at the University of Utrecht. His PhD research was on the Belizean Garofuna and ethnicity. In 2002, he started a research project with some of his students on the organizational activities of the Mennonites in Belize. One of the main issues is the question how the different Mennonite communities navigate between the religious principles and their farm-related entrepreneurial activities with people or organizations in the Belizean society. He is currently an emeritus associate professor at the Free University of Amsterdam, Faculty of Social Sciences, Department of Organizational Sciences. Finally, Patrick Friesen, born and raised mostly in Paraguay in Menno Colony, is director of the Department of Communication and Culture of the a civil association in Loma Plata. For 12 years, he is married with 2 children. Following family traditions, he got his teaching certificate in Paraguay and later on a master's degree in mass communication at the University of Leicester. The Department of C&C comprises the work and initiatives in the field of history of Menno Colony as the Historical Archives Museum and Historical Sites and Publishing. Furthermore, the department works in internal and external communication and public relations. Let us welcome all 4 of these panelists, and we'll start with Dr. Canova.
Buenas tardes, Baixapa. Greetings from the Paraguayan Chaco. First of all, thank you, Ben, and everyone for this really wonderful conference. And I want to say a special thanks to the people who are making possible that we can follow this via Zoom. So thanks for all the work. As you can see from my title, I will be sharing what I consider are preliminary observations from an ongoing work on Mennonite women and cattle ranching in the Paraguayan Chaco. And this is part of a broader ongoing project that I now have on cattle ranching and environmental changes taking place in the Chaco. So first, I became intrigued in the topic at the Expo Pioneros in May of this year. This is a ranching and agricultural fair organized by the 3 Mennonite colonies in the Chaco. And as I attended the event, I saw no women in several of the talks that were being offered to the public. And the last day, very interestingly, there was only one talk given by a Mennonite woman from Eastern Paraguay, Tres Palmas, and she talked about her experiences running a dairy. What was fascinating about the talk is that it was attended mostly by Mennonite women and couples, but the overall presence and perspectives of women were not represented at the event at all. So my question was, where are all the women? And I also learned at the event that today Fernheim has about 750 members who are farmers, of which over 600 are involved in cattle ranching. And so this also drove me to ask, what about female involvement in cattle ranching as this shift is happening in Fernheim? And so let me give you a bit of background on ranching in Paraguay and El Chaco. Ranching has become the major economic activity in Western Paraguay, as scholars like Yann, who's today at the panel, have written about. This expansion is not only related to the global demand for meat, but also is a result of local technological and accessibility improvements. And Mennonite living in the Chaco have played a major role in this development. The construction of the Trans-Chaco Highway is an example. Advancement related to soil productivity, water retention systems have also played a key role, and particularly the development of drought-resistant pastures. But the expansion of cattle ranching has come at a high environmental cost, as Paraguay is today has one of the highest rates of deforestation in the region. And it is estimated that between 2010 and 2019, the Paraguayan side of the Gran Chaco lost about 2.4 million hectares of forest. And between 2010 and 2020, the number of cattle has increased by almost 60%. So while this is not part of what I want to talk about today, I think it is important to mention and recognize that this deforestation has taken a toll on indigenous population, and Hannes has just talked about that, and has also, it has mainly displaced them from their territories, and many of these groups live and work in the proximity of the Mennonite colonies in the central Chaco. So what I am interested in exploring is how ranching is reinscribing the social landscape of the region, but in this case, in particular, Mennonite women and their place within their society. So while in general, most cattle ranch expansion in the Paraguayan Chaco happens in large-scale ranches, in this presentation, I focus on what are considered mid-size or smaller size ranches. And unlike the typical ranch in the Chaco, which are considered male-only spaces, what differentiates these ranches is that they are run by women. So the Chaco, like most frontier zones, have been constructed and conceived as masculine spaces in the imaginary of most Paraguayans. These are spaces where women are expected to fit into established gender categories as either providers of domestic labor or providers of sexual intimacy. And life on cattle ranches is very iconic of this. These are also spaces where men express certain masculine self-representations that are not allowed in other social contexts. Like the Paraguayan society in general, the Mennonite social structure is also patriarchal. Women have very specific socioeconomic roles, but this small group of Mennonite women, I believe, are pushing the internal boundaries of this structure by reinscribing what it means to be a Mennonite woman today. We know from the narrative of elder women from Fernheim that women have historically played a key role in the socioeconomic unit and have helped the families established themselves here in the Chaco, working side by side with men. And most women would take charge of, be in charge of working in the dairy farms, working their veggies gardens, and taking care of animals. The public sphere, on the other hand, was reserved for men. Men were the administrative and religious leaders in the colony. And I think Lady Munoz did a very good description of this, how these gender roles work in the private and public sphere. So although Fernheim has become in recent decades much more urban, the structure, the overall structure, I argue, remains pretty much in place. And an example of this is the membership structure of Fernheim, the cooperative system. In Fernheim, members of the co-op are mostly men, so of roughly 2,200 individuals, and these numbers are rough, 2,000 of them are men, and 100 to 150 are women. This is because in the majority of cases, men are the ones who become members, while women sign as dependent members. So children older than 18 can become individual members, but usually what happens is after young women get married, they shift to become dependents again. Not again, but so the few female members are therefore either single women or widows. Members tell me informally that this structure is set up in such a way to so that the families can receive more economic benefits if women are included as dependents. Last year, for the first time in the history of Fernheim colony, 92 years, Marilu Sieber was elected to the Administrative Council, a position similar, I would say, to that of ministers to lead the area of health in the colony. This is a major, significant step towards gender inclusion, but women must still overcome large barriers to occupy such posts, since in order to become a candidate, you need to be a voting member. And we, right now, there, as I said, there are only 100 to 150 women who are in that position. So the heart of Mennonite life here is their co-op system, and the fact that women are excluded from decision-making processes within that structure is notable. And within this background, I like to turn attention to this group of women who are taking this independent leadership role in running their own ranches. And I call them cowgirls, and I do so because I think even though their ages range from 26 to 84, they have the vitality and the passion of young women. And so who exactly are they? So far, I have encountered only 10 of them in Fernheim. And here I need to stop and acknowledge the collaborative nature of research. And I don't think I would have never found or be able to trace these women if it wasn't for the help of two amazing path breakers, Fernheimers, Adeline Friesen and Amari Kettler, that I like to thank them for helping me. So the eldest of the women is 84 years old, and the youngest is 26, as I said. Most of them are head of their own ranches. The ranches vary in size, and the primary activity also varies. Some are rearing, others are engaged in fattening, finishing, and some in the whole production cycle. They raise different breeds of cattle, and the sizes also vary. Some of these women have had professional training and others have learned from experience. To give you a sense of who they are, let me share the stories of two of them with you. And just before I move to the story, this woman is amazing. In this picture, she had just moved 300 animals from one pasture to the other, just with a motorbike, and honking and calling them to come. And this is something amazing if you are usually large states use more than two individuals to do that job. So the first one that I call Mary is 50 years old and is the third of 4 siblings. As we rode on her truck to her 250-hectare ranch near the aldea where she lives, she shared with me with a huge smile on her face how as a small child, she would ride on horse every day alongside her father to move cattle from one pasture to another. She inherited the ranch from her father 7 years ago. Prior to that, she worked in the service sector while raising her 3 children. The size of her herd varies between 100 and 250 animals. Like most Mennonites, by the mid-80s, her father gave up on horses and started using motorbikes to round up cattle. Today, Mary argues that this is still the most efficient way to work, especially as she is on her own. As we slowly cross one of her pastures, we pass by large and tame cows with their calves, whom she knows by name and characteristics. That yellow one, she tells me, is very mean when she has calves, very protective. Calling them "Komt, Komt," the cows run by the truck into the next pasture. Confidently, she shares how she usually rounds up the herd of over 200 on her own into the corral to sanitize them. And she says, it's not that much work, just that on those days, I can run home to cook lunch as I usually do. Karin is another cowgirl I became acquainted with. Unlike Mary, Karin is younger. She's 38 and was trained as a veterinary doctor in Asunción. She still vividly remembers going to Asunción for the first time. She said, all I had was a suitcase and a backpack. My parents didn't have much at the time, but they supported my education, especially my father. When she got back to the Chaco, she was hired by the Co-op Extension Service, where she was in charge of visiting ranches to assist them, perform births, surgeries of animals, and help with artificial insemination. She bought a 300-hectare ranch with her husband in a nearby village by Philadelphia 15 years ago, and she happily shared that they are finally paying off the debt. She and her partner work together, but according to her, his job is always on the tractor, sowing seeds and harvesting those seeds, the seeds we sell. I am the one who works with the cattle. Recently, she had to hire one Paraguayan helper as the job has become harder with her 2 small children. They usually have between 100 and 150 animals, but now they only have 50 due to the ongoing drought. So like Mary, Karin not only manages the ranch, but also takes care of house and children. And she says ranching is a lot of work, but nothing like milking. Her worst childhood memories are still those of having to help her mother milk the cows. So like most women I interviewed, Karin and Mary's passion for ranching has come not free of social tension regarding their new gender roles in this economic activity. Although Mary's family and friends support her, she's aware of how her role is challenging preconceived roles for women within the community. For example, when she goes to buy bulls, she often says she gets looks, as this is something that mostly men do, or only men do. A dream of Mary has been to attend an auction where she could actually buy the animals herself. She says, I watch it a lot on TV, but this is something that, as she put it, she would not do it to show respect for her husband, as people would gossip if she transpassed this male sphere, only sphere. Like most women I talk to, they share that in family reunions, for example, most of the time they end eavesdropping the men's group conversations as they talk and share their ranching experiences. As one of them put it, I'm not into flower beds or recipes. I rather hear about the latest animal grazing methods. So Karin vividly remembers her first job assignment as a vet doctor. The Mennonite rancher she visited in order to perform a surgery told her, quote, I asked for a vet doctor, not a woman. Do you think veterinary staff is for women? End quote. In spite of this, Karin got on the horse, took the animal down, and was successful with the procedure. And by the way, Karin also shared that after her last assignment, 5 years later, was with the same rancher, and he actually was very kind in his words to her after getting to know her. Another aspect that cowgirls like Karin often mention is the challenge of having to negotiate with partners, managing money and making decisions for the ranch. Women deploy different strategies to make their partners feel included and to avoid tension. So aware of the environmental pressures that ranching is putting on the region, all women I interviewed mentioned being aware of the growing deforestation affecting the region. However, their discourses seem removed from this reality. As one of them put it, I don't understand why people say we Mennonites are part of the deforestation program. Some of the younger women mentioned that monitoring of the monitoring of wild animals is a new trend in the colonies and among friends who have ranches. They mentioned that Friesen has started a competition to award people who have the highest amount of wild animals on their property for 365 consecutive days, monitored by hidden cameras or trap cameras. Most of the ranches that these women have inherited or bought are relatively small and have been operating since at least the 1960s. And so I think many of these, the younger generation at least, wasn't even born when these forests were turned down with indigenous labor force. And I think this is why deforestation does not feel as close to home. Reflecting on how deforestation is affecting regions beyond the central Chaco where they live would most likely help them reflect on a broader history of ranching in the Chaco and its impact of the environment and also indigenous peoples. While this work is still ongoing, it is obvious that the lives that women such as Mary, Karin, and others are silently crafting a new path within an economic activity conceived just for men and not women. Other members of the community see them, and I heard these references, as the different ones, the crazy ones, but their practices have the potential to redraw the lines of expected gender roles in the colonies and beyond. They are taking the main role as decision makers. They are managing money, which in some interviews, it felt like bringing a lot of tension, especially among couples. They are managing workers. And more importantly, they are pushing the spatial boundaries of ranching as a male-only space. And to this, it's important to understand that in the Paraguayan culture, and these women are also managing Paraguayan laborers in their ranches, and it's that dynamic, that power dynamic can bring a lot of tensions. And these women are also engaging in ranching practices that are really different than what goes on in Paraguayan ranches. So as I said, they are moving 300 animals with a bike, something that men on horses usually, and no less than 2 do it in other contexts. They are also taming horses, which in the Paraguayan ranching culture is an activity exclusively of the male domain. So these women have had the courage to follow their passion in a context where their role as cowgirls is perceived in tension at times with other family duties like childcare and cooking. So far, the ones that are married mentioned being able to manage doing both. The stories of these women, like women in other contexts, make it clear that they have a double burden of having to prove not only that they are professional at what they do and can do it well, but that they also have to measure up to the social expectations of the community. The women I interviewed are all very sensitive to the expectations of community life, and all of them have found their own way to navigate these tensions. And while they didn't express it in this way, they all share instances of asserting their autonomy and perspective vis-a-vis other people, be that siblings, parents, or partners. What is fascinating is that, and I'm not sure that they realize this, but I think these women are slowly starting to change the face of what ranching looks like in the Mennonite colonies of the Central Chaco. Thank you all for listening.
All right, hello. Let me just figure out the PowerPoint first. All right. Can you hear me? Yes, good. All right. It's sufficiently late in the conference that I don't want to not be heard. You will fall asleep, probably. I also tend to mumble, so make just big gestures if I start speaking very fast and oh, I'm already mumbling. Okay, thank you. Here we go. Thanks for your honesty. Okay, so I forgot I had put so much in the bio, so I already can skip a few slides, but I'm a geographer. I'm not a Mennonite scholar. I'm a Mennonite curious, if that makes sense. So I'm someone who studies land use processes in different places, lately mostly in South America, and this is how I come to talk about Mennonite stuff. Okay, now I gotta figure the buttons. Okay, so my primary object of interest is agricultural frontiers. And I would define that as spaces where agriculture, being croplands or ranchland, is expanding over other types of environments. So it could be typically forests, as you can see here, but also other types of environments, right? But the idea is that there is a drastic change of land use. And I've been interested in that for a long time, and one reason for that is that those are spaces of drastic transitions and of great tensions between different models of living, of economic development, different projects, right? So you'll have a project of economic development through agriculture, for instance, and other life projects of people who might have lived in those spaces before that agriculture comes. And so you've got these incredible tensions around social issues, around environmental issues, which I think are really worth investigating. And I've been doing that for a while now in the Chaco, and so thanks Paola for giving such a great contextual introduction to the Chaco. So I've been looking at frontiers in the Chaco, which you see there, which spans over Argentina, Bolivia, and Paraguay, and you see a lot of red and brown there, and those are places where forests have been replaced by cropland and ranchland over the last few decades. And I'm not going to go into that except to say that this is kind of how I come to look at Mennonite issues, because it's hard to look at the Chaco without considering the presence and impact of Mennonite colonies in the Chaco, right? So you've got the Menno and Fernheim and Neuland colonies right in the middle of that, and as I was doing interviews with large-scale farmers, mostly across the region, I came to talk to a number of people in those places and got more curious about that story. And if you, as you all know, if you start looking and thinking about land use and the use of land specifically by Mennonite communities across the world, and across Latin America specifically, you find them everywhere, right? Like there's really a lot of Mennonite colonies in Latin America. So, and I spend a lot of time on Google Earth, so it's easy to get lost in looking for all the places where you find the traces, the sort of typical patterns of Mennonite colonies. And you find them in Mexico, in Paraguay, Belize, Bolivia, and more. And importantly, you find them not just, we've talked a lot about old migration here, but you find a lot of new, very recent colonies as well, right? And there's one in Bolivia from 2015, but there's been a lot of new colonies since the 2000s, as a lot of you, I'm sure, are aware. And as I was doing that, I also realized how little information, or like summary information there is about that. So that got me kind of curious. Now, another dimension of this, so remember, I'm thinking about frontiers. When we think about land use in frontiers, as geographers, there's been a lot of discussion of two sort of types of actors and dynamics. One being smallholders, colonizers, going to these forest frontiers. Think Brazil, smallholders being encouraged by the government to take land in those frontiers, make a living there, with or without support from the government, sometimes direct action, land reform, people taking up land, etc. So that's one movement. Another movement is large capitalist farms moving to the frontier to make a profit, buying land for cheap, developing it, cutting the forest typically, and then growing something there, or maybe selling the land for a profit, right? There's those two sort of movements. One thing that's interesting about those colonies is that they similarly settle these remote places, if you will, places that are often remote from the point of view of infrastructure and agriculture, but not quite for the same reasons. There is, as we've discussed extensively, this strong cultural preservation imperative in these movements. And so that makes it kind of distinct and really interesting in terms of understanding the development of frontiers in Latin America. And it's interesting also because we know that early settlers in forest frontiers typically have an impact, right? Not only locally where they settled. You can see the colony of Tamane in Bolivia here. Obviously, there is an impact in terms of the deforestation happening in the frontier and the agricultural production, depending on whether you want to put a positive or negative spin on it. But there is an impact that's localized, but there is also the possibility that this presence will have an influence on what happens around them, right? And so what we've seen over and over again is people settling in remote places, Mennonites or others, and others starting to congregate around them because you have roads that are built, you have infrastructure, you have reasons why it's becoming interesting to be there. And so I'm really curious to kind of wrap it up, like the introduction up. I'm really curious about that process by which you have, on the one hand, choices that are made based not only on profit seeking or the household life cycle, but also based on cultural imperatives that end up snowballing into the development of agricultural frontiers in Latin America. Okay, so that's kind of the broad interest here. Culture leads to choices, cultural imperatives, cultural preservation leads to choices about where to go, what to do, and this potentially snowballs into frontier expansion. At least it's a hypothesis. There is basically a theoretical and an empirical dimension to this. So the empirical dimension is, I think there was a lot of information that's still needed or still needs to be found about what exactly is going on. There's so many colonies. Who are these people? Where are they coming from? What are the impacts locally? But also a theoretical dimension about the impacts of culture on land use change in these frontier regions. So I'm going to break this down into it's more of a research program than a really finished research. So you'll see some maps and stuff, and you'll see a lot of questions that I hope to be exploring in the next few years. But I want to talk a bit about patterns of expansion. I want to talk a little bit about what are the stories and pathways that led us to where we are, and then about causes, drivers of expansion, and finally about some impacts. So I'm going to start with mapping. I saw that there wasn't really a good map of all the colonies, at least not one that includes colonies created after, I don't know, 1985. There's the atlas that a lot of you probably have at home that is great, but very outdated. And generally a lack of understanding of where those people are coming from and going to and so on. So I set out to basically try to fill those gaps with the help of pretty much everything I could find, which includes lots of stuff produced by the members of this audience, including the Mennonite Post, thanks Kenneth, who's right here, and the help of a number of mapping enthusiasts, people from the colonies who were willing to share maps that their administrations produced, number of books, etc. So I used that, and I also used satellite imagery to produce those maps. So this is Google Earth. Google Earth is surprisingly useful. You have the history function, you can go back in time, but I also used other imagery. If you're interested, I can give you more detail. I don't think most people would be interested in knowing what that was. But I use all that to produce a map of the colonies. This is, and a database, if you will. So this is a presentation of that map. I'll tell you where, you can download the data, you can see it in Google Earth if you're interested, tell you where afterwards. But basically this is the product, right? You have a map of 200 plus colonies across Latin America. Here they're colored by age of existence. So the red colonies are newer, blue colonies are older. And then you have this sort of table of where people came from to what colonies, which is hopefully mostly accurate. I'm sure there's a few mistakes in there or a few things that need to be updated, but it's a start. Another way of displaying that is this bubble graph, which I like. It shows the amount of land by colony. Each bubble is a colony. And then the colors, again, are darker colors for newer colonies and lighter colors for older colonies. And you already see some patterns. First of all, the total area of land. And I believe that this is kind of the first time we have a bit of an estimate of that. And it's a minimum estimate. It's definitely more than that, but this is at least as much as this. It's about 4 million hectares, so that's more than the total area of land of the Netherlands, which I think is a fun fact, just to think about. And you see different patterns, right? You see Paraguay, 3 massive colonies, everyone knows which they are, and then a bunch of other colonies. Bolivia has many, many colonies, but many of them kind of similarly medium-sized. And then you see some new countries emerging, Colombia, Peru, as destinations for Mennonites. So that's a very brief overview of the lay of the land. Now, pathways, we've talked a bunch about these international migrations. We know the stories. There have been multiple flows internationally. I'm not even showing the intranational flows here because that would be a big mess. But of course, there are those migrations from Chihuahua to Campeche, et cetera, et cetera. So many, many different migrations here. Another way to show this, and this is getting messed up here, so we'll have to see if I can. Okay, well, this is going to be interesting. This was already a complex graph, and this is looking like it's already it's also not working. Okay. Well, okay, let's see if I can do something with this because this is really not working. This is when you get too ambitious with the functionalities of PowerPoint. Ooh, okay, yeah, this is really not working. Okay, well, sorry about that. I'm going to try to get past it. So what this was, and before I switch to Bolivia, what this was, and you can find it again, there's all of that is available, was a way of displaying the expansion of these colonies with one bar representing one colony and horizontal lines representing who from what colony created a new colony. And by looking at all these lines, you can see patterns, for instance, of Bolivia having a lot of offshoots internally within Bolivia of new colonies, but other countries, such as Mexico, having a lot of international offshoots, so new colonies created in other countries from the Chihuahua colonies and later also the Campeche colonies. So just thinking about patterns of expansion. Further to that, we've got Bolivia here, and we can zoom in on one context here. You see a lot of red, a lot of new colonies, and some white, older colonies. And we've had different trends of expansion within Bolivia. So towards the east, we've got a number of migrants from other places outside Bolivia, but also a number of people coming from Bolivian colonies and expanding eastwards because of lack of land and demographic growth, etc. You see a little patch of white here. That's, if I can point to it, well, I can't, but you see a little patch of white in the east, and that's the colony of, I believe it's called Nueva Esperanza from Belize, that was created very early on and very far away. So, other trends of endogenous growth, but also immigration from eastern Paraguay, from Argentina, northern Mexico, and then a lot recently of new colonies created by people who were already in Bolivia but need more land and expand, especially in the Chiquitania region over there, where a lot of that has been happening, but even further in towards the Beni and the Amazon in Bolivia. So again, just to think about these sort of broader patterns. There's much more to say about it. I don't have time for it, but it's interesting to think about. As for the causes, and I have 5 minutes, I'm aware of that. So I think we all know this broadly, but I wanted to kind of formalize a little bit what are these pushes and pulls that are happening there. Again, this is in the spirit of trying to understand what's the balance of cultural factors and other factors, economic factors, demographic factors in pushing people out to create new colonies and in pulling them to certain specific places. And so we've got a number of things going on, right? We've got, of course, a question of land scarcity, which is related to demographic growth, more people needing land and new colonies being formed. And so people will go where there is a lot of land. 5 minutes, thank you. We've heard about agronomical and climatic issues, especially in Chihuahua, lack of water, lack of rainfall. There is also a question of access to markets. And then we've got all these causes having to do with cultural preservation. So we've heard about worldliness and trying to avoid it, the threats at the national level to privileges, sometimes religious schisms, differences in opinions within a community that lead people to look for places that are often further away, and hopefully that also allow them to preserve the privileges that they need. Okay, so that has often led people to settle really far away. So I talked about that colony, Nueva Esperanza, I think, in the Bolivian lowlands, 250 kilometers from developed agricultural land from Santa Cruz. More recently, we've got new colonies in the Peruvian Amazon on the Ucayali River, 200 kilometers from Pucallpa. That's really, really far away. This indicates probably a prevalence of these cultural imperatives of being away from the worldliness of it all in deciding where to go. Okay, so there are these questions, and these are all kind of hypotheses, things that I hope to more formally explore and test in the future, okay? But so what is this influence of culture on the choices of location and on the choices of what to do? And I'm going to show you a very preliminary plot here. I even have two, but I might skip the second one because it looks like the first one. But I'm trying to, and this is back of the envelope calculation, this will change, but I'm trying to see if we can see an association between the types of denominations of churches as an indicator of more or less conservative colonies, or the adoption of technology, so steel wheels, no steel wheels, rubber tires or not, and where people have located at the beginning of their colonies. So in this case, what's the amount of land where they were that was already developed as agriculture? Did they go to a place with just forest, or did they go to a place that had agriculture? Did they really want to be far away, or was it okay that there was already something? And so you can see maybe some patterns. I don't want to make too many conclusions here yet. Statistically, it's not that clear. But you can see a little bit, for instance, the old colony groups have a pretty low bar there, which indicates that they've often settled in places that didn't have any agriculture, right? Whereas others, here the Sommerfelder, might have more often settled in places that had a little bit of agriculture. Okay, so this is just exploratory, just something to think about, and I will hopefully follow up with more concrete results. We're going to skip that. I think I'm at the end, but what's the point of all this? For me, as not a Mennonite scholar, I'm interested in the sort of broader picture of what that all means for these frontiers. What's the role of these colonies in the development of these frontiers as one of many actors present in these areas? Do they accelerate the development and the expansion of agricultural frontiers, and with what sort of environmental and social costs? What is, what is the extent of their role in that? And I have a couple of just thinking points, not completely mature thinking points, but I'm noticing there is a lot of, and I'm at the end of my time, but if you look at the media, there's a lot of pushback. There's a very bad press right now of Mennonite colonies in Latin America. And so it makes me wonder a little bit, okay, I put here, what's the end game, right? Like people have expanded and continue to expand. There are more and more and more colonies in places like Bolivia. Now people are going to Suriname. They're exploring Angola in Africa. Where does it end? Now people are becoming more and more these sort of environmental pariahs. Is that what we want, or what to do with that, right? And a note on sustainability, there's increasingly talk about sustainability, but it remains in the realm of how do we keep producing for a very long time. The sustainability of conservation and keeping forests intact is not as much a debate yet, and I think it should be, as well as the social impacts that we've already discussed a little bit. So I'm going to skip the other things, but thank you very much. There is more to be found on that website, which is of my research group. You can find Spanish and German translations of the paper that we wrote on this, and the data you can have it, see it on Google Earth, etc., etc. And thanks for your attention, and thanks to everyone who's produced stuff that allowed me to make those maps. I can't name everyone, but I couldn't have done that without them. Thank you.
Yeah, hello. I'm Carel Roessingh. It's coming down there. I'm also not a Mennonite. I'm a Mennonite, follower also. Interested in Mennonites and in Belize, because in Belize, this little country where Aldous Huxley said, if there is an end of the world, it would be Belize, because Belize doesn't go anywhere, and it will in the future not go anywhere also. It's almost like away from the world. That's the reason I think that some of the Mennonites thought we have to go to Belize. Because if you are in Belize, they say go slow, and that is a very interesting way of thinking, but keep moving. That is also a lesson of the world, I think. Take it slow, but keep it moving. Where I'm talking about is that, this is Belize, of course. You see here a map where I try to show you all the settlements of the Mennonites in Belize. What I am wondering all the time is everybody is talking here all the time about Mennonites. But if I talk about Mennonites, I don't know precisely of which Mennonite I'm talking. Because if we are in Belize, we have the Hoover Mennonites, we have the Old Colony Mennonites, we have the EMC Mennonites, we have Kleine Gemeinde. So it's a very differentiated group, which is also very important to understand what happens if they are entrepreneurial, trying to expand their farming and their way of living. So you get this Mennonite migration, external, but also internal, because there are also groups who were, well, not satisfied with the old colony way of life, or they were not satisfied with the life in Spanish Lookout. They wanted to be more out of the world. And in Belize, you have this Hoover Mennonite group who is really trying to be out of the world. They are in the jungle without electricity and without running water. But still, also, this group is now very slowly expanding themselves to the outworld. First, I want to show you the symbolic of boundaries between the world and their world. The first is the road to Springfield, founded in 1996. Then we see this is Springfield. I always like these pictures. Look what beautiful. Why won't you live there in this tropical sunshine? And here we see the road to Birdwalk. It's founded 2011. And here you see another way of keeping, well, Mennonite followers, interested persons out of the community by the river. Everybody's talking about rain and water, and so that's also okay. But in Belize, there's very much water. And as the floods come down, you cannot go over this river. You are standing on one side and you have to yell, hey, hello, can we do business? But they have their business, sawmills in Birdwalk, and here a meeting house in Birdwalk. I'm not so very known in Birdwalk, but it's expanding, but I will come on that later. Here is another river that is founded to Rosefield, founded in 2012. And this is the farm of the old deacon of Springfield, who is now living in Rosefield to keep the thing going there, moving on. That is also, well, expanding. People from other villages come to live in their village. Okay, now I have to go back and... I did it. Yeah, thank you. And this is where it's about for me. This is Fredrik Barth, and he is an old anthropologist from Norway, and he didn't have anything to do with Belize or with Mennonites, but what he did was looking at entrepreneurial behavior. How are entrepreneurial behavior, what is that? How are they dealing with the world around them? He did his main thing in Norway, but also in Burma. Well, swears he's talking about, it's a little bit theoretical, but what he said, there are three things you have to look at. You can look, you don't have to. You can look if you look at entrepreneurship. The first one is bridging, which I will explain as last. Then stretching Mennonite community and allying across. This is very much what they are doing in the country in Belize. You can really see how it works if you look at that country. First of all, here you see how it looks on, if you want to make a kind of a picture of it, you see the sub-ethnic groups, they are allying with each other. If they have their religion, if the rules, the values are stretching, then it's getting more expanding outside, and you have the bridging between the ethnic group and the country around it. If you look at the Blue Creek Mennonites of the EMC, you can almost ask yourself, can they stretch? Because they do everything. You know, if you look at the EMC Mennonites in Blue Creek, it's if you are not with Mennonites, if you think how it should be. But they are Mennonites, and they say of themselves also Mennonites. They are very interacting also with Pentecostal groups and singing and playing in the church. Another group that is the Spanish Lookout group, which I think is Kleine Gemeinde EMC, which is also not so stretching anymore, but there is space for stretching. The other two, that is the old colony in my case, in a shipyard, and of course the Mennonites of Springfield. Well, stretching. I will try to get very fast to it because otherwise you're staying 5 minutes. Okay. This is a little bit, is it stretching or not? But they are using things on their buggies that they can look what is at the back of them, and you have to do that on the dangerous roads of Belize highways because it's rather dangerous to drive there. I don't drive there because I'm a little bit afraid of it. This is very important. This is the marketplace. Springfield was closed. They didn't want to have outsiders inside. I was always very thankful that I could get in there with the bishop and talking with him. But they opened almost their borders for outsiders to come in. And I have to do this again. And they have now a market in there. So the stretching is not from outside, it's from inside. They've said we have to make contact and sell our products in the marketplace. Here, this is also stretching. I don't know, you know more about Mennonites maybe in that kind of situation as I, but this is a tractor with rubber tires. But if I look very well, it's an old colony driver. And they are not allowed to drive. They have to have iron wheels. So I don't know what is happening here. Maybe I shouldn't make this picture, and maybe I'm a traitor. But this is very well stretching. This gives movements. Well, and of course, this EMC, computers, phones, they are coming in, and then we're talking about Blue Creek and Spanish Lookout, but it's also a period in 1958 that they didn't have that, and so they had to stretch to do this kind of things. Sorry, I'm moving with my hands. Allying across Mennonite communities, that is, I think, very important. It was a Mennonite who said to me, I rather work with brothers than with others. And that is, if you can say, well, nice that he said, but what do you say? Brothers, that is Mennonite, but which Mennonite? Every Mennonite. So the funny thing is, inside of the Mennonite community, they say of each other, even if you are a Hoover Mennonite or you are Old Colony, you are a Mennonite. So the basic is okay. So you can ally with us. But if you are a mestizo or a Garifuna or another, then you're not a brother. You're another. I'm another. Sometimes nice, sometimes not. But it's something which is, I think, very important. They make the rules. Yeah, and this is, sorry, I can go. I wanted to show you an organizational card, but you can see there, but we can go on because I have more. This is Maya Papaya. It's not so, well, it doesn't exist anymore, let's say that. But they started with, and it was done by Americans, investors, EMC, Kleine Gemeinde, and Old Colony. They worked together. And here you see what happened. The ladies from, in this situation, Indian Creek, they were working there in the factory for the papayas to move on and take it out. Go away. Here you see another thing, and that is, I think, also interesting, if I may say so. Here is a Kleine Gemeinde driving his tractor with Old Colony people in the truck. So here they are working together on the farm, and here you see a kind of working together. That is Circle R, that's a rice factory. Shareholders, then there are 5 the Mennonites, and an EMC Mennonite, EMC, and then you see truck drivers in Kleine Gemeinde, and the workers are Old Colony and local employees. And it's not said that always local employees are accepted also by the Old Colony. They can say, we don't want to work with the other. So then mostly the EMC men are trying, yeah, but we have to do that because it's good for the company and so forth and so forth. Well, that is also a way of stretching. I said in Dutch words, it's also Mennonite, and so forth and so forth. I don't know if that's also old, what is it, plat Duits, but maybe it sounds plat Duits, and so forth. Okay, sorry, I thought that was funny, but it's maybe not. This is the factory of the rice factory, and here you see that it's rice, and they sell it, and they do good business. Before the whole Corona problem, they were also selling it to the countries like Guatemala and Mexico, because they are very near the border of Mexico. And well, one of my colleagues, Emma Hubens, who works a little bit on the other side, knows that the Mennonites from Belize and northern in that part, Campeche and Roessingh are very well. They have much contact with each other. Bridging, that's the last one. And here is Springfield. This is Springfield. You want to keep people out of your community. The first thing you do, you put that on the sign and ask people to come in. And they come in to buy all fruit nursery and also trees. Very funny, I think it's very funny. This family is in whole Belize. They know those people. It's a harder family, and they have the best trees and everything. You go to Springfield to buy trees or to flowers because they have so good stuff. The market open from Monday and Thursday. It's running in cars, people who buy salad, tomatoes, everything from outside. So you cannot say they are isolated anymore. They have very much frequent contact with the outside world. This is Spanish Lookout. I think very much of the people who are sitting here and have been in Belize have been to Spanish Lookout, because you can much contact between, well, you have been there, I know that. It's much contact between Canada, EMC Mennonites in Blue Creek and Spanish Lookout. Spanish Lookout is very interesting. If you ever go to Belize, I can give you a tip. Go to Spanish Lookout to buy ice cream. They have the most nice ice cream I ever have had. I'm from Holland, we know ice cream. The Italians know ice cream. But the Dutch have the nicest ice cream. It's crowded there with people, and the most of the employees are Belizean locals. So the managers are the kleine gemeente or the EMC people. Most of the workers are, I hear the sound of paper, are from outside. Now, this is Reimers, I go very fast now. Reimers Feed Mill, also Spanish Lookout. They have outposts in Belize City, in Spanish Lookout, in San Ignacio. There they sell their products. You can make an order there. But this one is very sweet. One of the things, besides ice cream, and of course the beautiful surroundings with birds of Belize, another attraction is the Belize Zoo. The Belize Zoo is it's symbolizing something of nature in Belize. All the animals in Belize, which are in Belize, are in the Belize Zoo. It's an educational project also. Children go there. And what is surprising, Reimers Feed Mill, if you're talking about bridging, is sponsoring the food of this group. This is very important also in the feeling of, well, those Mennonites, they are not so bad. You don't go to them. No, go to them. They have it. They help you. They are doing good stuff for us. And sorry that I'm saying, that is what I feel in Belize. Not every Belizean is very happy with Mennonites, but they know, and they say it also, they are the ones who, entrepreneurial, but also economically, are very important for this country. and its situation in the world. Blue Creek, well, chicken, leghorn. I don't know the farmers here, but they know what a leghorn chicken is. Well, you see here, they're hanging there on their feet. And this is one of the last, so I'm almost finished. I have not been in Belize now for 2-3 years because of Corona. You couldn't come in Belize. It's one of the countries that was really closed. Yeah, so I have not been in, but I got information that Barton Creek, Upper Barton Creek, which is also Hoover Mennonites, that is abandoned, and I'm very curious where it is. Well, this is Belize, and thank you. Thank you.
So, last presentation of these 2 days. I'm glad you're so fresh and energized. So many good presentations here, and so no pressure. Thank you for the possibility. I want to speak about Menno Colony. I want to speak about the church in Menno Colony, living the tensions between faith, change, and tradition. I come from Menno, I live there. So the trip to this conference has been as long as the conference itself until now. So I will try to move forward before you see the error there. So in 1927, conservative Mennonites fled, dare I say, fled Canada to found Menno Colony in the Paraguay and Chaco, looking to maintain century-old ways of education and faith. And this migration project had started with the delegations, with the visit of the delegations in 1921. We have touched upon Menno Colony in a couple of these presentings here, Ernie and Hannes, among a few others. So I believe the history or the story is more or less widely known. So Menno Colony was founded with the intent to preserve, to refuse change, and to isolate. Of the originally 1,743 pioneers who moved out of Manitoba and Saskatchewan towards South America, 1,247 moved onto their own land, the most stubborn of all. Founded the first 14 villages in the central Chaco, and as to this day, 2 of these pioneers still live in Menno Colony, so they would be 95 years or more. As far as we know, there's 2 more alive, one in Canada and one in Bolivia. So today, Menno Colony comprises 104 villages. 95 years later, the same community finds itself challenged with shaping integration to assume social and environmental responsibility and to maintain a high standard of education. So what we want to think about is what role has the church played in this story, and how does it continue to do so? So in Paraguay today, there's about 40,000 Mennonites of migrational background. We live in 20 different colonies, and around 11,000 of these make up the Menno Colony. The migration and the settlement was organized and initiated by the church. However, first, I sometimes say the church won't feed you. So first, the Asociación Civil Čorticer Comité, that's the name, and the Cooperativa Čorticer as social and financial economic structure, respectively, were put into place to organize community life. So the term Mennonite in Paraguay comes with some ethnic connotation. So people refer to Mennonites or see Mennonites as someone living in communities, sometimes dressing in overalls, sometimes not, focusing on economic progress, sometimes smelling funny, having a non-Latino appearance, and also they are usually seen as well-off, economically speaking. So Menno Colony functioned as a state within a state, and here the church was inseparably interwoven with educational, social, and economic endeavors of the Mennonites. So church and tradition more or less transcended all areas of everyday life, and soon calls for innovation clashed with the sense of tradition in the community, and obviously tensions emerged. So 3 different churches or congregations from Canada, the Sommerfelder, the Chortitza, and the Bergtaler from Saskatchewan, merged into one church. And this was a rather rare phenomenon because in its 200-year history, divisions had taken place because of small differences in opinion. For example, clothing or singing or the growing out of a beard for men. And furthermore, the cultural and educational reform in Menno took place without a significant fragmentation of the church. So who were these founders of Menno colony? Were not old colony Mennonites who preferred to leave land and homestead for an unknown land full of new challenges. And how did they understand faith? I will refer to them as Bergtaler. It's probably somewhat a limited concept, but I will explain why. The Bergtaler were the first to found Chortitza colony in Russia, then Bergtal, and later on pioneered the settlements in Canada and Paraguay and partially in Mexico. And it was never their strength nor their interest to theorize theology and confessions of faith. Faith was always expressed through and understood on par with education, with belonging to a church, and with complying with traditions, was understood on par with privileges, even with the German language, although we, or Bergtaler in this sense, did not usually see themselves as Germans. And I will make an attempt to characterize the Bergtaler based on some bullet points put together by Eduard Friesen, a colleague from Menno. So Bergtaler understood faith through the lens of values, such as honesty, solidarity, helpfulness, work ethic, and so forth. And his understanding of congregation was leader-centric. The Ältester was attributed a significant amount of power, and he was authorized to decide about religious, social, and economic matters, all social matters or community matters, on behalf of the community. In this, it was important that he remain within the century-long boundaries set by tradition. However, Bergtaler were basically open for new technologies, insofar they serve economic progress. Their understanding of humbleness bordered on self-contempt. However, if others treated him accordingly, they were quickly judged as arrogant and worldly, something we don't have to do, we don't do anymore. They were willing to pay a price for their convictions, as repeated migrations have shown. They exercised social control over members of the community who somehow stood out, and they understood divine intervention and God's workings as affirmation of their own convictions and as support in challenging situation. And they did not understand divine intervention as a way of changing traditional elements of faith that would lead to change. 2 important processes have impacted the community deeply in these 95 years. One, in the 1950s, a school reform took place. We remember, we fled because of the schools in a large part. And 2, in the 1970s, the congregation was decentralized. This included the deposition of the Ältestenamt. Ältester Martin C. Friesen had been the driving force to reform the school and the church in his 40 years as congregational leader since 1925, and his focus was to keep the community together and to prevent fragmentations. And it is noteworthy to mention that the 3 congregations were led by one Ältester in Paraguay. Aaron Zacharias from Bergtal died before reaching Menno colony, and the Sommerfelder group emigrated without their Ältester. And one cannot exclude the influence of the neighboring colonies, Fernheim and Neuland, on this process in Menno. These neighboring colonies were founded by political refugees who were fighting for survival, and they therefore had a less traditionalistic worldview and a different mindset. The 3 colonies found themselves in the Chaco in complete and utter isolation without any medical, educational, and communicational structure provided by the government. So change in this sense, in a loose description of a word, refers to an alteration of behavior which leads the community to a reform. And these reforms in Menno have created tensions, social and religious tensions. Let us have a look at some, briefly. 3 tension fields. Church versus education. 2 important points that we remember. Ältester Friesen, writing about the migration from Canada to Paraguay in 1926, noted that school was held on the ship no later than the 4th day of the trip from New York to Buenos Aires. Second, the first buildings in the first 14 villages in the Chaco, in Menno colony, were schools, sometimes even before the settlers themselves had built their homes. So the refusal to change education was the main reason of the migration to Paraguay. School was to remain the same as it had been for the last 200 years, because its main role was not to teach as much, but to preserve the church. Any involvement from the state in this matter was obviously seen as a direct threat. And ironically, within 3 decades in the Chaco, a school reform took place, initiated by people from within the community calling for innovation. And isolation certainly played a role in this process. Many saw no chance of survival for the colony without more connectivity, for example, to the local market, to the national market. Educational reform in Menno was a slow process. The Leerdienst, a committee designed for church matters, oversaw the schools and put the Schulordnung into effect. And as such, education was always understood as equivalent to congregation, in accordance with the phrase, what the school is now, the congregation becomes tomorrow. A school reform, therefore, would necessarily create tensions. The new school building, for example, constructed in the 1950s, was repeatedly vandalized by community members who opposed the reform. This led to some community members, or to several community members, several families moving to Bolivia. So church was to preserve Mennonite identity, and any change in tradition threatened the only known expression of faith known by Mennonites in centuries. This educational reform inevitably affected church leadership. Church and education had a reciprocal effect on each other, leading to the gradual opening or loosening of church traditions. The church in Menno today is still involved in educational matters through representation of a church member on the school board. And teachers from the community today are still required to be active members of a Mennonite congregation. That does not mean that we do not contract non-members as teachers. Second, church tradition versus renewal. In a meeting held by representatives of the Canadian Mennonites interested in migration in 1922, it was decided that the church leader would be responsible for the migration. So in the Chaco, schools and churches would be the main priorities. And as Martin V. Friesen resumes, the church already underwent its first stress test in Puerto Casado, where we heard yesterday from Ernie the story of his ancestors, where the migrants had to camp for 1.5 years in a provisional settlement, and where about 10% died. The whole congregation would only be formed later when they had settled down in Menno colony. And the Ältester was in charge of maintaining the tradition of the church services, for example, singing, dress code, sermons, baptism, and so forth. Bible studies were not allowed, and children were largely excluded from the congregation until they themselves decided to become baptized. Every change in form and tradition of liturgy required a long process and created tensions between the opposing fields. So, 1977, the Ältestenamt, as the leader of the church, was replaced with 2 conferences, the Nordmenno and the Südmenno Conference. This decentralization of congregation, of churches, was done to better organize the congregation and give each church more independence in theological matters, but as well in organizational matters. Obviously, this involved that a lot more people were getting involved in spiritual life. Today, these conferences comprise 16 congregations with more than 6,000 members. And these changes in congregational matters take time. Today, the church is challenged to define its role within the cultural and economic settings of the colonies. And in 2020, for example, the churches in Menno saw themselves challenged with a situation no one had anticipated, the lockdown. We're probably not the only churches. Most Menno churches transitioned to online sermons. So that was something that was not even remotely had been discussed before, but not without considerable protest from some members. The order not to gather was widely seen and felt as a spiritual threat. So the challenges continue. The question of accepting divorced members into congregation is a question that moves us. Churches will need to define their stance on gay marriage, should it be legalized in Paraguay at some point. It's in the church, worship, teaching, and counseling have become priorities to tradition. Missionary work was not on the horizon in the first 2 decades in Menno. As the colonists settled, however, the Entlit, a local indigenous tribe, we heard from Hannes before, settled as well. And around the 1950s, some congregations in Menno felt a calling and missionary projects began to take shape, where understanding of indigenous culture would be required and a missionary mandate needed to be established. We have heard one of the challenges that perspective has shown us. We remember, however, that indigenous groups were completely and totally out of reach of government development projects. So today the churches in Menno participate in several development projects. I call it development projects, although the word is misused frequently, because the spiritual guidance is always usually only one part of these initiatives. So there's a list of some programs that are in place. Many of these are so-called thank you projects to the Paraguayan peoples, brought to life by the MCC and later on handed over to the Mennonites in Paraguay. Although the primary focus of the MCC was the aiding of colonies of refugees that came to Paraguay, Menno colonies soon participated. So today, Mennonite churches in Paraguay carry these projects of approximately $25 million in family services, in counseling, in farming, in production, in entrepreneurship, in education, healthcare, missionary initiatives, and so forth. So that's an intent, an attempt to give back. So church versus economy, briefly, the main social and economic institutions in Menno arose from the church. Economic activities was seen and judged through the lens of belief. However, as seen in Mennonite communities around all of the world, prospects of economic growth have opened the doors for social and spiritual change. For example, the discussion to work on Sundays or the decision to sell alcoholic beverages. The conservative church collided with economic progress. The complete absence of government institutions for decades in the Chaco prevented the assimilation process, seen by Mennonites living under stronger governments, such as Canada, US, or Brazil, where educational and family services or healthcare were good. This required Menno colony to be independent and focus on growth and consolidation. So the Menno colony Mennonites are embedded in church and congregation on one hand. On the other hand, they are the main protagonists of an ever-growing player in the local and regional economy. Menno colony today finds itself among the largest cotton, dairy, and beef producers in Paraguay. And this provokes a strong migration to the colonies of people in search of work and opportunities. So going forward, new tension fields will emerge. We have not even spoken about church versus politics, for example. Today we find Mennonites among governors, mayors, senators, congressmen, and even presidential candidates in Paraguay. So reflecting the whole concept of Menno colony in its spiritual, social, and economic structure is rooted in isolation and self-sustainability. And the main question today is, which role does the Mennonite community play in the Paraguay and Chaco going forward? The church, with its tradition, has overcome the extreme hardships of settlement and colonization, but will it be able to overcome wealth and prosperity? How will we shape change now that there are thousands of people migrating to the Chaco in search of work and opportunities, and where international investors' interests are sparked? How will we hand over values to a young generation that is culturally aligned with Paraguay, maybe with the whole world? The first settlers arrived to preserve schools. We are challenged to bring forth professionals. The first settlers intended to isolate. We have to integrate. The first settlers had to fight nature for each grain and produce. We need to preserve. How will church interact with community and congregation? And how will it respond to its mandate of social responsibility, of environmental awareness, of peacekeeping, and, why not, of missionary projects within the multicultural setting that we live in today? Thank you.
We can now open it up to questions. Somebody had the little mic.
Hello, I have a question for Paola. I'm hoping she'll be able to hear me. Hello, I'm Tracy Huresca. Thank you for your talk. I'm curious about women's involvement in ranching as opposed to farming. And I'm wondering if it seems to you that it might be easier for Mennonite women to become involved in ranching because it's not maybe seen as such a traditional Mennonite activity in the way that crop agriculture would be? Or is there a similar women's movement into crop agriculture as well?
Thank you for that question. In doing this, gathering this data in the field, I focus exclusively on ranching. I didn't look for women engaged in farming or dairy, and so I wouldn't know how to answer you. I wouldn't have an answer for you. But I do think, though, that because many women I have spoken to over the years in talking about working in the farm and in terms of in farming and in dairy, has not been as strange as engaging in ranching. And I think what drove me to these women is that they were managing, they own and manage the ranches themselves. Usually I would think, and maybe Patrick can talk from experience in Menno colony, or someone in the audience that is familiar with Mennonite colonies in the Chaco, but I think it wouldn't feel as controversial to engage in farming or dairy, and to the already established gender roles, right? So I think these women are kind of outliers, but I haven't done research, and I have actually just focused on cattle ranching. I heard that about women engaging in raising minor animals like sheep and cabras, but I haven't explored their work. I wanted to focus exclusively on ranching.
Hi, this is Sam here. This question is for Carel. Specifically with the Mennonites in Belize, there seems to be some sort of class divide associated with also denomination. Have you noticed that in other parts, with the old colony being the laborers, then the management being the Kleingemeinde, and then the board of directors being the more liberal EMC or EMMC. Is that across the board in Belize, or was just that one example? And to what effect does that have? Like, are they just laborers and then they have their own farms that they work on and they're just seasonal labor? Or is this large-scale agricultural companies having an effect on the idea of small-scale land ownership amongst the Mennonites in Belize?
Ooh. Well, I think that if I understand your question well, it's more that EMC managers, factory holders use old colony Mennonites from shipyards, Indian Creek, who are fighting with getting enough money in, that their farms are not working well. And then we have the problem of, it's not a problem, but it's not my problem. There were very much children, so the expansion of land, because we're talking all the time also about land, is also an issue in Belize. You cannot go and chop the forest, so it's all the time, where can we get some land? What I understand is that this is one of the solutions, that the big guys from the EMC, but also from Spanish Lookout, hire Old Colony, but also Hoover Mennonites from the smaller, or who don't have so much money to spend as employees. The other thing is that what I have heard is also that the Mennonites are moving out from Belize to Peru, for instance. And I was very interested, I don't know where, oh, that was you. Colombia, are they also from Belize? Because they are also trying to find new land and on. But the funny thing is, and that I think is very interesting, but I think that is interesting, that those Hoover Mennonites bought land like Rosefield and Birdwalk. Barton Creek was abandoned, but they have now new land in the southern part of Belize. But the question of you is that the EMC are the big, they are the big managers. They have very much people who come and work for them, so that it's local, and that are Mennonites from the old colony. And that's the reason I told you that they started to say, we only want to work with brothers and not with others, because they didn't want those other guys in the factory, because that was also the problem, that they didn't have so much the chance to come into those factories. You know, if you can get a cheaper mestizo, you take the mestizo, because that is also Mennonite. Huh? Looking at what is the most, cheapest investment. Yeah. I want to say one thing more, but it's also a little bit not in question, but I was very interested, and it's a little bit whoop. Yann said that Suriname is one of the pictures. What I have got as a Dutchman, we are old colony Suriname owners, that Suriname doesn't want Mennonites. They don't want them to get in. And that would be very interesting, because then it's one of the countries that said we don't want them. I don't know, that is maybe a loose remark where you can say, and so what? Well, so what? Yeah. But I wanted to say that. Thank you for your question.
Question. I'm Roydon Lowen. I want to congratulate, this is a very interesting panel, so congratulations to all of you. I want to congratulate Ben for producing a conference as this amazing balance between the Spanish and English, between contemporary and historic. But there's a little chide, first you congratulate and then you chide slightly, and it comes by way of question to Patrick, actually. And that is, Patrick, your paper is one of the only papers on religion in a conference that looks at a migration that was spawned entirely almost by a religious question. And I'm wondering whether you want to comment on that. And maybe secondly also, maybe slightly chiding to you, Patrick, is that you introduced us to your church, Menno Colony Church, and I appreciate that very much. But what's happened to the migration theology that propelled these people to make this costly migration in 1926 to unknown land? It seems that the migration, all that cost was for nothing, because you sure sound like a typical Manitoba congregation.
Is that good or bad? Yes, yes. The question is, I believe in Menno Colony, what are we? As what do we define ourselves? Because we were taught you are Mennonite by faith, and in Paraguay we are seen as Mennonites by ethnic background. I believe, for example, the control over education has just shifted. It has not gone away. The control, for example, today we form teachers. We work according to requirements of the Paraguayan curriculum. If that really has to do with the theology that our ancestors, or the faith that our ancestors brought along, I would have to say no, because that is very, very far away from how we perceive faith today. And as for paper on religion, I'm no, how did I say to Ben? I'm nothing of everything I'm supposed to do here. So I'm not really an academic in that sense. I'm not a historian, and I'm not a theologian. So that's why it's easy to speak about these things for me.
Hi, Richard Ratzlaff. A question for Patrick, but also the others who talked about Paraguay, if they want to intervene. Nobody's mentioned the Bioceanic, which is going to bisect the continent and run right through the Mennonite colonies, especially, I think, Loma Plata. So what impact will that have on the Mennonite colonies? And maybe put that in the context of Tracy's comment that it is his understanding that the Mennonites do not have the institutions to solve problems. So I wonder how you would respond to Tracy as well.
I believe, let me say a few words to that. The Bioceanica, what that will bring, nobody knows. People prepare. Well, maybe others should have comment on that as well, because I'm biased on that. I live there. But we don't know what happens if Brazil opens the floodgates of people. Nobody knows if traffic is going to come through there. What we know is things will change, because the Chaco will be a bridge and will be a hub. So economically speaking and socially speaking, there are very many new challenges. But what exactly they will bring, it's difficult to tell. And create solutions, that's a question. When I say the colonies were founded for complete autonomy, with the idea of complete autonomy in mind. They function within a state, as a state within a state, so they have certain institutions, if security or education or healthcare, in that sense, they have autonomy, but they are no government. So we need government policies to be able to do something. Within that margin, within that framework, we can work.
So I would like also to, if possible, to share about thank you for that question about the Bioceanica, because I think it's gonna totally change the landscape of the Central Chaco. I do think that Patrick is right. There are unforeseen consequences, and the impact of this is still to be seen socially. I think economically, this has been a project that has been conceived or worked with the Mennonite colonies, leadership from the colonies. Initially, the Bioceanica is a project that has been on the making for years. Now it's crossing by actually Menno colony, and it goes up to Carmelo Peralta, which is the border with Brazil, where the bridge is being built. And the idea is that it will go up to Pozo Hondo, to the region where, and Yann, maybe you can also talk a bit about the impact on that area. But it is crossing right now, not through, yes, through the Mennonite colonies, but to the site of Menno, of Menno colony, and it will eventually impact indigenous peoples in a major way. The second part of the Bioceanic project would actually cross right through the heart of Ayoreo territory, and I think it will dramatically change. So there are two sides of it, right? Economically, I think it's a major outlet for commodities. Soybean is now booming in the Paraguay and Chaco. I don't think we have talked about this in this conference, but it's also, so the Bioceanica is going to change that landscape. But I do think that Mennonites have played a major role so that it runs through the Mennonite colonies. The initial project meant to go through Mariscal Estigarribia, which is a Paraguayan town, and they didn't have the political power to actually make it go through there. So it crosses nearby, but not really through its heart. So just wanted to add that.
I guess I'll just say a few words about, you said I would say something about Pozo Hondo. So at the end of the road in Paraguay is town of Pozo Hondo on the border with Argentina. I spent some time last summer there. I could say what people were saying about it. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know what people are imagining, right, a little bit. And people in Pozo Hondo there's a lot of fear that they're completely unprepared for it, because they're a border town, and a lot of things can happen in a border town once traffic increases, right? And they already have problems with drug trafficking and criminality and stuff. So there is quite a bit of fear about more of that. I also spent some time in a nearby indigenous community that has a relatively secure territory, so there was maybe more optimistic anticipation of better services, better access to hospitals, and things like that. Perhaps also because their territory is not directly threatened by potentially land speculation in the area. So there's definitely also a lot of expectation of big profits, lots of much more production and stuff, which might also be a bit overdone. How much more soybeans are there going to be because of that road? It's not that clear. Some people say that it's not going to change very much. So we've got to, I don't know, we'll see. Yeah.
Hi, me again. This is a question also for Carel or Patrick. It's more concerning about Mennonite identity, right? The identity seems to be on a spectrum between maybe something like ethnicity and then religion. Sometimes German, sometimes German-ish, sometimes Dutch, and then sometimes more Protestant, sometimes more Anabaptist. I've heard about the Belizean colonies that there's actually an Amish kind of working together with a lot of the Mennonites. So Pennsylvania's Dutch-speaking Amish working with Low German-speaking Mennonites, and they're kind of combining under this idea of Anabaptist. So I just was wondering if you had heard anything about that, and if the spectrum is between ethnicity and religion, is there a way that it can expand towards one or the other, or does it have to be something that it chooses a side?
You have the possibility to select your identity. I always say if Paraguay plays soccer, then we put on the jersey. Just not right now, because for the World Cup we didn't qualify. So, so then we can put on the Canadian jersey. There's 4,300 Canadians in Menno colony. So if that not, we might just put on the German jersey at some point. So That does not respond a question to religion or ethnicity, but maybe it gives you an idea of that we cannot know in which way that goes. I, for example, believe our young people today can defend better what they believe in. They have their creed. They can formulate that better than we could. They know exactly what they believe in, and they know how to word and phrase it. In that sense, they would probably be better prepared than we. My generation, which technically it's not so long ago, but.
Technically very long ago, but ethnicity is, I think, almost the most important word. Religion is, in my eyes, a part of ethnicity, like religion, history, languages. You know, the Mennonites in Belize, which group you take, they can always get away from everybody by talking their own language. And I think that on that moment you use your ethnicity to be different from the others. So it's a very complicated word because it's explosive. We don't want to talk about ethnicity. Look at the world now. It's a big ethnicity problem we have. Ask Mr. Putin about that. But it is there, and I agree. You know, you can say about Paraguay they didn't get in there, but well, Holland did. So we go to the World Cup in Qatar, you know. But it's a very national thing where the ethnicity groups, Suriname, old Suriname groups, people from Morocco, Dutch, play together. But still, there is this tension in my eyes. Sorry that I have to say that. There's always tensions. What is your background? Yeah. Well, that is actually you give the answer. You can baptize yourself. If I would baptize myself to a Mennonite, I still am not a Mennonite. I'm not in Garifuna. That is a fact. And you can make it very hard and difficult, but you can also accept it and try to play with it. That's what I think.
Please join me again in saying thank you for this wonderful panel. And I believe now we will be closed with some remarks by Ben.
All right, everyone. Well, we've run a little bit over time, and that speaks to the robust nature of this conference and all the presenters that came here, so I won't keep you long. There's a bunch of thanks that I have to do, but I'll just return briefly to the subject of the conference, of course, that we had this very unexpected migration that took place a century ago. It didn't necessarily fit the patterns of migration that we were seeing at the time, and it unleashed innumerable responses, right? Environmental responses, cultural responses, and our presenters over the last couple of days have reflected on that. The search for permanence often led to dramatic changes as well, whether in landscapes or in gender relations, or in relationships with neighbors and indigenous communities on which Mennonites settled as they left Canada in the 1920s. That's a very brief summary, but again, I think the main emphasis that I want to make is the robust nature of the presenters and the real value in interdisciplinary work, right? We've seen people who have their basis in political ecology, speaking to those coming from a literature background, to historians, right, to geographers, and we've moved beyond that as well, I hope, as this conference always had when Roy put it together, to welcome in members of the general public, to welcome in scholars whose personal lives are bound up in these communities, and that's why I hope Patrick as a member of Menno Colony, or Abe as an educator, an activist, also feel just as welcome here as anyone else for this conference and going forward. Speaking of going forward, I'd be remiss if I didn't give you a pitch. Aileen, my co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, mentioned that as Mennonites departed for Latin America, a new wave of Mennonites arrived. And indeed, next year in July, we will be commemorating the Roessingh Mennonites and their 100 years as they arrived in Canada at that time. I think then turning to the thanks, of which there are many things I need to say. First of all, thanks to Jeremy Wiebe and Aileen Friesen, who I work with on almost every single thing at the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, for all of your hard work for this conference. I think we lived up to our transnational mandate based on the presentations I heard. Thank you to the planning committee, which did include Aileen, as well as Paola Canova, who might still hopefully be here on Zoom, and Rebecca Jansen. Thank you so much for reviewing these many great submissions. For a brief moment, when we decided on this conference topic, I was terrified we might not have enough people to fill out 2 days. That was a foolish thought, and I recant it. And speaking of Rebecca and the other impromptu translators that made this multilingual conference work, thank you so much. We're very grateful for that, because I think, again, we would be remiss if we didn't build bridges between scholars in Latin America and here in Canada. We had a wonderful volunteer, Kate Molden, who was here from my migration and ethnicity class for the entire conference, running around with microphones, corralling coffee deliveries and signing folks in, so thank you as well. And again, yes, of course, the very existence of this conference would not have been possible without the generous support of the Plet Foundation. To be able to continue to have free conferences open to the public and bring in scholars, not just locally, but from around the globe. And finally, thanks to Roy Lowen, who I think had this listed as a conference topic when he handed the reins to me in 2020, but did none of the other work to prepare us for this. But the idea was all of yours and none of mine. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Let's give a round of applause to all our presenters. And